Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at Open Networking Summit in Antwerp, Belgium. But today we have a special guest. I don't even know whether I should call you a guest or not. We have known each other for a very long time.
Yes, we have.
And you have played a very critical role in my career once I moved to the US. I was new here, so you kind of played the role of my mentor. And whatever, journalistic career I have here,
right.
You play a big role in that. So first of all, thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. I think you've done a lot of it by yourself. I don't know how much help you really needed from me, but...
No, you really, you and Libby Clark, she also, she gave me the first break, but
right.
You also played a big role in, connecting me to the right people. So
right.
Thanks for that. But I admire you more for the work that you do. As a journalist, especially in the open source world. So let's just geek out a bit about what's going on in this open source world these days. All the way from Richard Stallman or desktop Linux or enterprise Linux. So these days, what are the pet peeves you have when it comes to open source?
Well, I'm a little bit still vexed about the entire open core thing, which when you get over the licensing wars, which I geek out about, I dive into that in some of my stories, and I've got more stories on that coming. But when you get right down to it, I see open core as being about two things, really. One is it's just marketing. It lets companies use open source in a way that makes them sound open source friendly. So companies who care about that go, okay, this works for us. But it is just a marketing, it's a branding over what's a semi-proprietary approach. Because if you can't use the code the way you want to use the code, then it's not really open source. If you restrict it, then it's no longer open source. I mean, it's fine. You can still use it. You can still market it. More power to you. Just don't try to confuse people that it's really open source. Just being able to look at the code alone isn't the same thing as having the freedom to use that code the way that you would like to. The other thing that I see that's wrong with open core is that it's basically sort of a band-aid over failed business models. There are successful open source business models, such as support, which is probably the most popular one, and there are providing services with those, with that open source code. Just because Amazon does a really good job of taking open source code and putting it into services doesn't mean that you too can't take your code and turn it into services. If you fail to do so, that's more on you as a business than it is with the cloud companies just being better at you and packaging it up in a way that people will want to use and are willing to pay for.
When we look at open core, and you compare it with, that it's kind of, semi-proprietary order. So let's just go back and look at what was the basic idea of open source that you think that open core is failing. So what is the basic idea of open source?
The basic idea of open source is that we are better off as both developers and businesses as cooperating together in creating the best possible code. And it's sort of with proprietary and to some extent open core models, it's all about we have the best package, we have the best solution. Open source says, no, you don't, because you're only coming at it from your one angle, you're keeping it to yourself. You're not opening it up to get as many developers to work with you as possible. With open source, we all work together. The water rises, all ships rise with the water so that we are all better. Then the companies can compete on other issues, developers can compete on a code issue, on the code level, but it just works better for everyone, for both creating software and not so much as a business model per se, but as a way to enable other business models and to better facilitate service models. Like actually here we are at Open Network Summit. These companies, the telcos, they do not like each other. They do not like each other at all. But they realize that while, yes, they could each have their own little proprietary way of creating this program or that protocol, if they do that, they end up hurting each other in the long run. Verizon may not want you to go to AT&T and vice versa, but they know that if they have a Verizon-specific software stack or an AT&T-specific software stack, those stacks will be weaker than one that will work across all platforms. So, while it's difficult for the telecoms to work together, they have realized they really must do this because it simply makes better business sense to work on these lower levels, the infrastructure levels that customers will never see. But what customers will see, but they'll never realize what's behind it because they could care less about infrastructure, they can see that their telephone call will go through when they want it to go through, and that's the bottom line. They want to better support their customers. To better support their customers, it's better to use an open source approach where everyone shares in creating the intellectual property that makes all these other services possible.
So, how different is open core from traditional open source? Because open source, if you look at the definition from OSI or or if OCI, OSI, open source initiative, not OCI. Right, yeah. I'm not talking Oracle Cloud, or Open Container Initiative or FSF. The basic idea is basically that if there is first of all, I should be able to see the source code. Right. I should be able to use the source code, and I should be able to redistribute the source code. I think these are the basic ideas behind it. So what are the restrictions that open core puts on these three, or four ideas?
Open core restricts you. It's a very much a bottom line issue. Open core restricts you from what you can do with the source code. And that means, say I'm a developer and I'm contributing to your project. I don't have the freedom to allow some other company to use that code in a way that I would like them to use that code, or at least have the freedom to use that code. I may disagree vehemently, actually, with how they want to use that code, but at the same time, by making it open source, I give that source, I don't give it away, but I give everyone the freedom to use that code in the way they see fit. So long as they don't go against the license. Open core, in a variety of different licensing models, restricts the right to use that code. Just simply being able to see the code is not the same thing as being able to use it or deploy it in whatever way a user might want to use it. And this is bad. So
do you think that open core is reaching a point where you should start getting worried about it, or it's just on the sidelines of the wider open source movement, or it's just a few companies which are just reacting to, as you rightly said, it's they're trying to solve a business problem with license, which is not the right way to approach.
Right. I think open core is not going to go away. I think there's a lot of people having trouble wrapping their minds around open source based business models, and open core is much easier to use business model because it's a proprietary model.
Yes.
And proprietary is easy. I've got this special thing that you can only get from me, therefore you should pay me money. It's a much easier sell. I've got the special sauce. Worked for Burger King, it can work for these companies as well. But again, it's fine, but it's not open source. That's why I just object to the confusion over marketing.
Right, and I fully agree with you there. Now let's talk about another of your topic that you cover regularly, which is desktop Linux.
Right.
So, how relevant is desktop in today's world?
The desktop is still relevant, but it is changing. It's changing rapidly. Over the last few years, with the advent of smartphones and to a lesser extent tablets, it's become very clear that the desktop is no longer the center of the end user universe. It's really the smartphone is what the vast majority of people use. And as a result, they're using the desktop less and less, which is sort of a shame because the smartphone is ultimately, it's just a consumer device. You can't really create on a smartphone. You certainly can't code on a smartphone, or at least not easily. And so the PC at large is becoming a more and more of a niche market. The core end user experience today is the smartphone, which is why I like to argue that really, in some ways, Linux won the end user wars, because the majority of users today, the single most popular operating system is Android. It's not Windows, it's not iOS. Android is what I believe the plurality of people now use, according to the last numbers I've seen from a number of people. That said, though, for creators, people who actually do work, whether it's making videos like you do, or writing, or coders, or anyone who actually creates something, the desktop is still vital. But the desktop itself is still changing. Microsoft is still the Windows producer, but Windows is no longer really that important a product to them per se. Yes, they really would like you to use Windows 10, but it's become very clear in the last couple of years that Microsoft is moving to a service model, not just for server programs on Azure, but on the desktop as well. I don't anticipate there really being another major Windows desktop release. There will be significant Windows 10 updates and so on. Back in the day, we used to call them service packs. They no longer call them that, but essentially that's what they are. They are major updates of the existing operating systems. But a true Windows 11, I don't see. But what I do see happening is Windows as a desktop service. That is happening, it is coming, and just as Google has used Chrome OS to provide its desktop experience that allows you to use their Office program and so on, Microsoft is doing that. In fact, Microsoft has come out and said, no, you shouldn't buy Office 2019, you should subscribe to Office 365. And that buy and subscribe are very significant here, because Microsoft is moving to this subscription model. And how this all relates back to the Linux desktop is that as Microsoft moves away from a traditional desktop interface to this service-based interface, if you want to have an operating system that actually is on your desktop, that you control, if you control the horizontal, you control the vertical, it's going to be either Linux or Mac OS. Now, Mac OS, as I know you would agree, is a great operating system, but it's not for everyone. Linux, on the other hand, has over the years had numerous problems with interoperability between different versions, with packaging of software programs, with support from independent software vendors. But for a lot of users, it's not going to be it. If you really care about the old idea of the desktop being the center of your computing life, Linux is going to be really your only choice, because it's not going to be Microsoft's, because again, Microsoft is moving away from that world. And that said, the Linux desktop still needs to rise up to that challenge. The Linux desktop software providers need to work together to come up with a desktop that will be easier for non-technical end users to run. I mean, I know Bash backwards and forwards, but expecting in 2019 for users to really learn shell programming or use VI or Emacs for their editor, it's simply not going to happen. Programmers and system administrators will. Ordinary users are never going to go there. And for that to happen, though, again, they need to work together to bring some rhyme and reason to their interoperability problems, to actually work on cleaning up their interfaces so that it's easier to use. And that is starting to happen. The GNOME and KDE are getting together in Barcelona in a couple of months. There have been previous attempts to sort of normalize the Linux desktop between some of the major players, and I'm hoping this will happen in a couple of months in Barcelona. They will actually make some solid positive moves forward so that the Linux desktop becomes a more viable option for people rather than an option only for power users and for people who are willing to devote the time to learning how to do it well. If it's ever going to happen, if the Linux desktop, conventional Linux desktop is ever to become important, it needs to happen now because Windows 7 comes to its support end of life at the end of this year. And so you're going to have a lot of users who are not crazy about moving to Windows 10 in the first place, because they're even now not quite a majority, but a substantial number of Windows users are still on 7. They don't want to move to 10. They'd like to have some other option. That other option, I think, could be the Linux desktop. Again, if the desktop people can get together and come up with a option that's more appealing to them than our current potpourri of different distributions, all of which look and work just enough different that you cannot, for example, say easily move from, say, Linux Mint to Fedora to OpenSUSE to, Arch. I mean, there are dozens of them, but again,
dozens?
Dozens of distributions. Yeah, there are still dozens of distributions.
Just go to DistroWatch and you'll see how many are there.
Yeah, they're probably not quite 100. They're still viable. Mm-hmm. They're still being supported out there. Many of which have only probably no more than a couple of hundred users. Some of them, like Ubuntu and Mint, probably have hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of users, which sounds like a really big number until you consider Windows. I just checked that the other day, has about 1.1 billion users. So yeah, a million users sounds really big until you compare it to that.
I understand what Microsoft is doing there because I use all three platforms, and by moving to that, first of all, as I think Microsoft said, that Windows 10 is the last, Windows release, because I also use Adobe. I'm subscribed to it, so there is no Adobe 6, 7, or 8 anymore. It's just Adobe Cloud. But I get updates on almost weekly basis. So I don't have to. Yes, I have to pay heavily, but I think it solves two problems for Microsoft. One is that when they invest a lot of money and come up with a new version, somebody has to pay it so that they can keep the development.
Sure.
And second is to just keep people safe. One of the biggest problems with Windows XP was nobody was updating it. I mean, you and I work in the software. You have to keep it patched and updated, and people are lazy to do that. So the only way you can do is what WordPress did. It forces up. It keeps your package updated all the time. I run my TFI on WordPress. We have not. So that is the model Microsoft is moving to, and a subscription-based model is somebody where you ensure that everybody is paying. And actually nowadays Microsoft, even if you use a copy without paying the license fee, all it shows is that it's not a verified copy. Microsoft lets you use Windows for free. The big problem that I see with Linux, something that you touched upon, is that most of the commercial vendors, Red Hat, SUSE, Canonical, they have pulled out of desktop because they see there is no market in the desktop space. As I talked to Linus also, he says fragmentation is a problem. Second problem is none of my cameras support Linux. I cannot update the firmware. I cannot update firmware of drone. So it's sometime I was reading an article on Forbes that hey, if Adobe Premiere comes to Linux, no, because it's not just the Premiere. There's a whole ecosystem of plugins. There is a whole. So the problem is not that is small and it seems like, because the thing with the general purpose computing is, even sometimes I struggle on my Mac, is that you should be able to plug anything. And that's what Microsoft did. It was an open ecosystem where you can write a driver around it, against it. Anybody can write a driver. You can download it from the internet and use it on Windows. With iOS, you have to go to Apple Store to do that. So that was the thing with desktop, and that's where I see that it's also because those desktop communities, Noam and Katie, they can do only so much. But that itself is a problem. Look at Elementary OS. They want to build their own, walled garden. They have a beautiful operating system. Zorin has been different approach. Linux Mint. So the thing is, every distribution, they have 10,000 users, which are enough to sustain that project. Elementary OS OS is getting good money from those 10,000 users.
Right.
But as you said, as compared to 1 billion users, so it works for that particular company or community, but it breaks the whole. So there's so many problems in desktop.
There are. It's both the beauty and the problem of Linux desktop is, yes, you can pretty much have any desktop you want, and you can find no matter what you want, you can probably find a community that'll make a desktop that you really like if you just look long enough. Which is all great, but again, if you're just an average user, you just want to plug your camera in and have it work. You want to be able to grab any computer and have it work pretty much like the last computer you had, and you don't want to worry with all this stuff. And the Linux desktop as it currently is doesn't have that. It's at least today you can get, let's say that you just want the desktop and the very idea of installing a distribution turns you white in terror. Well, that's not a problem. Dell will happily sell you one from a main name manufacturer, or if you want to, there are companies like The Reason and System 76, which make great machines that will help you and set you up and give you support and so on, all of which is great, but these are all niche markets. These are, as it is, the Linux desktop is a niche operating system. And I would like to see that change. And I'm hoping that things will happen so at least it becomes more friendly. In time, if the Linux desktop can become more friendly and gain more of a market share, then vendors will be willing to bring their device drivers and their firmware over. But it's a chicken and an egg sort of problem. It's where do you start to get this really rolling? I think the start could possibly happen in Barcelona. We'll see, but it will still be an uphill journey. But again, we do have a chance now because the one thing that the Linux desktop will give people is not just a desktop operating system in an age where desktop operating systems are being reduced in importance. It will give them control and privacy over their systems. Because at the moment, if you use a Mac, Windows not there anymore, or won't be in the next few years. The Mac, you're locked into the Apple ecosystem, which is fine. Lots of people love being in the Apple ecosystem. But for those people who want freedom and control over their systems, it's going to be, the Linux desktop will be the one and only solution. Unfortunately, it's a solution that, as it is today, has its own set of problems, which makes it harder for people to use than the others.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail there. First of all, I feel that the whole idea of that you can get a distribution for it, it's kind of overblown, But unless and until you're a developer is targeting a specific problem, what do you need on the operating system? You need a browser to be able to. You need there are 4 or 5 things that you need to be able to do. And when I look at any distribution, it's not that X is doing more than Y. They all do the same thing.
Yes.
But they create an unnecessary. Like for example, if you look at a car, it doesn't. When you talk about Teslas, those are totally different. You're talking autopilot. Most cars, you still get the same functionality. You might get something different in Volvo versus something different in Audi. But Linux, so I feel that the whole thing, that you will find the distribution that you need. But the thing is, basically the needs are same. You pick any distribution, it will work. So this whole, distribution customized for a particular niche is just overblown. That's what I feel,
No, I can see that argument. It's also sort of like to use the car analogy. Linux is very much it's a manual transmission car. You have to learn how to do, and it's not just one kind of manual transmission though. There's all different sorts. So the differences aren't that big really, but still you have to learn. Do you double clutch? Do you single clutch? It's not the same thing. Whereas macOS is, let's say, it's the Tesla of computer operating systems. It will assume it wants to be autonomous. It wants to, make everything easy, so long as you live in the Tesla, or in this case, Apple universe. And again, Windows is just moving away from it entirely to another model, which, ironically enough, is one that Google explored first with Chrome OS.
But the whole point is that what do you really want to do with your car? Do you just want to go from A point to B point,
right?
Or you just want to spend your whole time in just changing the gear, So
sure.
that's what I feel. I mean, one of the reasons, I when I travel, at home I use Linux. When I travel, I bring my Mac. Is that I don't know what I will be doing, So I want to be able to have that flexibility that with this machine I can plug anything and I'll get my work done.
Right.
So that is one thing that is there.
Right.
And the second thing that you said that Linux is a niche market, and that's what I feel that instead of targeting the general purpose audience, there are certain things that Linux does very well. I mean, not Linux does, because I talked to Greg and Linux, so they don't have any agenda with the Linux, it's the distribution. If you are a privacy-centric person,
right.
Even Matthew Garrett says, Windows is very secure and privacy-centric. Mac is catching up. Linux is way behind, but then you can or your researcher, your only option is fully air-gapped machine,
right.
With Linux running on it. So distribution should focus on this niche audience and capture this audience instead of trying to cater to everybody.
I could see that. Though the BSD people would say, no, if you want security, hi, we're over here, we're the people. Their problem, though, is they don't have enough desktop developers around, so they're, for all of Linux desktop problems, the BSD desktops are probably like 5 years behind, which is eternity in the computer universe. But I could see that. I could see someone marketing that. I don't know of anyone out there now who's doing that as their specific branding effort. We are the secure operating system, but someone probably should. There are penetration testing operating Linux distributions out there, certainly, but one which is just all about making you personally secure. I can't think of one off the top of my head that's really their primary message. So if anyone out there is listening and you want to make yet another Linux desktop distribution, well, there you go. There's a possibility for you.
So I feel that these are certain use cases.
Sure.
Of course, developers, that's why Microsoft is also bringing in a lot of Linux in there, because that's the preferred platform for developers.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Yeah, so I hope, let's say, as you said, the event that Noam and KD are working together, something will come up. I am not very hopeful, because I've been listening for almost 25 years now. But let's hope that they will do something.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm very hopeful. I just think now I see this as the conventional Linux desktop's best chance is right now.
Right.
Windows 7 is closing. Microsoft is moving away. Apple has become even more of a closed garden than it used to be. If the Linux desktop is to ever become a popular desktop today, 2020 is the year. If they can't get it done in the next 5 quarters, it will remain what it is, which is a niche operating system, which I use all the time, along with Chrome OS in my case, and which is fine. I'll still care about it and I'll still use it, but any talk of it ever becoming the year of the Linux desktop should be just put away.
Right. There were a couple of Windows XP happened, then Vista happened, then Windows 8 happened. There are so many missed opportunities.
Yes.
So the reason I'm less hopeful is that a lot of things are within the grasp of Linux community, but a lot of things are beyond their control. So I don't know. But the interesting thing that the year of Linux desktop might happen, but it may happen through Microsoft.
Yes.
They are already baked. So right now, Linux is running on 98% of machines that I was talking to Richard Brown, he used to be the chairman. And when I asked about him, he said, we like it because OpenSUSE, the OS is just one of the many tools that we have. We want people to have access to our tools.
Right.
So whether that tool is available on Linux distribution or a Windows distribution doesn't matter.
Right.
So people should be able to use, so we should be more accessible. So Windows is actually making Linux more accessible to a lot of people.
Yes.
So ironically, Microsoft may make it possible that your desktop on Linux.
There is Windows subsystem for Linux, which is actually 2.0 it's a true Linux kernel. It's no longer just imitating Linux's APIs on top of Windows. It's a honest-to-God Linux kernel running in Windows 10, which again, a niche audience, but there's a lot. I know a lot of Windows sysadmins who are now using it because it's just easier. And oh, by the way, even on Azure, the most popular server operating system is not Windows Server; it's Linux now. And by the way, the numbers are continuing to go up for Linux on that platform. Windows Server will become a niche server operating system the way things are going. And I recently, going back to the desktop, I recently suggested, and I'm somewhat serious about this, is why couldn't Windows just build a desktop operating system on top of a Linux? It could be done. You can run Windows applications on Linux now, thanks to Wine, have been able to for years. The technology is there. We know what to do. And if you look at the conventional Windows desktop, the quality assurance has just gone out the window there. Every major patch now of Windows comes with all these provisos. It breaks. You have regressions you need to reset. So why not just take the old NT kernel, kick it to the curb if you're no longer willing to invest in it, and instead use the Linux kernel, which is constantly being worked on and updated, and build Windows on top of the Linux kernel. It sounds like a ridiculous idea, but I could actually see it happening.
Yeah.
We'll see.
But I don't know whether it's more about the kernel level or, whenever I talk to Greg, a lot of, if you look at IoT devices, they all run on Linux, but they're insecure,
Right.
So it's not that much actually. Personally, what I feel is about how Microsoft is implementing all those upgrades, because they're dealing with almost 1 billion users, and there's so many use cases they can't even test all of that.
I would agree with that, except I've looked at a lot of this stuff over my other job of Computer World, where I do a lot of I do columns, and I'm frightened at just how bad these upgrades are.
Yeah.
I mean, Microsoft historically has had problems with patches, but in the last 2 years, the patches on Windows 10 have just been bad.
Because they have never done this kind of thing. As you said, they were always doing the patch, those, service packs and stuff like that.
Right.
So this is something new to them, I think. So they should actually, but I don't know whether they should, because if you look at the Linux market, it's very tiny compared to what Microsoft. Right. So why would they, look at a smaller market? It does make sense, in the enterprise space where everybody is using Linux. So I think that is what they're chasing, because Linux market is already so tiny in desktop.
Well, you see, I don't see it as chasing after the Linux market. For them, for them, the Linux desktop market is a rounding error. It simply won't matter to them.
Yes.
What I see them doing, though, is thinking that we're having so much trouble keeping conventional Windows 10 properly working, and it's happening at some fairly deep levels. Maybe it's time to take that old, messy architecture, shove it to the side, and put something underneath it that's better known, more well-developed, and is more secure, and run it on top of that.
Right.
And that, I think, is where the value add is for them. It would still look like Windows. People like you and I would care enormously about this, but the ordinary user wouldn't notice if they do it right, and if they.
Right. Yeah, Linux desktop is in a very strength, I think you have a very valid point. It does make sense, and I think as Microsoft is maturing itself with Linux,
right,
it will be, because they won't have to do a lot of work in maintaining their own kernel,
right,
and also as you rightly said, a lot of things on Azure, I think by now, because I talked to Julia 2 years ago, and then she said it's 50%. I should be 70% now.
Right.
And Microsoft themselves are consumer. Azure's networking switch runs on Linux.
Right.
Azure Sphere OS runs on Linux.
Right.
So they are, using Linux. So I think there might be a lot of work going on internally. We don't know yet.
There is. I grow really tired of people who are always saying Microsoft is just going to embrace, extend, and extinguish Linux.
Oh my God.
Get over it. You know, Ballmer is not the CEO anymore. This has been, actually, gosh, I should do a story on this. It will be 5 years that he came up, the CEO went up and said, we love Linux. And they're not just saying it, they're doing it. And by the way, Linux, sure, you can embrace it and you can extend it, but you can't extinguish it. It's a GPL2 license. Anything you do to it, you share with the universe. And I'll be doing actually an article about that real soon now, in which I talked with Linus and Greg and James Bottomley, all of which you say, of course Microsoft wants to change Linux. Guess what? Everybody wants to change Linux. And you know what? At the end of the day, though, none of them get their way because everything has to be done in an open source way.
Right.
And so you can't do it.
Right. Yeah, when I talked to Greg,
can't do it.
He said everybody is contributing to Linux in a very selfish manner, and we want selfish manner. We don't want you to do charity, because charity means, you might lose interest tomorrow. You're like, hey, no, we don't have that extra bucks, we cannot. But when it's selfish, as for your survival, second thing, as you rightly touched, that the reason Microsoft cannot extinguish Linux is whoever says so actually doesn't understand the open source model.
No, they don't.
So every time I hear it, I just get, as agitated as you get. First of all, you don't understand how open source actually work.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether it's GPL or BSD or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You don't know. Second thing is that, do you think company like Red Hat, Fujitsu, Intel, IBM, and SUSE, Canonical will just sit there and let Microsoft hijack it? And
no. Doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen. And then I've also seen a lot of unnecessary FUD that, hey, Microsoft has joined Linux Foundation and now they are going to influence these foundations, the way they work. They have technical committees, and then they have, all the code level decisions are made by developers. These foundations, what they do is they put resources in emails like that, where they can bring the community. And Linux Foundation is not a charity,
No.
It's a trade organization. Its job is to bring trade partners together to work on the technology, so they don't waste resources. So and the only way you can influence any open source project is by contributing more developers to it.
Right.
And you will contributing more developers if you get something back.
Right.
You're not just, hijack, because what will you get by wasting your money in paying those developers?
Right.
And sometimes I also hear a lot of, which I find at times, that I find it irritating that, this is a Microsoft employee who is working on kernel. They are Microsoft employees second.
Yes.
They have been working on Linux kernel for the last 30 years or so.
Right.
They just move from one company to other company.
Right.
That's it. They are committed to the kernel, not to a company.
Yeah, their primary loyalty is indeed to Linux. Like, KY, whose last name, sorry, I always get your name wrong. But he started out with AT&T, I think. Novell, I'm not sure where he went from there, now Microsoft. He's always been about the Linux kernel. Yes, he cares now about what Microsoft's pain point, which is they want Linux to work as well as possible with Azure. But so what? That's just one more thing that he can bring to the table. But his primary loyalty is to making the best possible Linux code. And actually, sort of switching back to our initial conversation about open core, and that's one of the differences between open source and open core, is that with open core, though, that's no longer true. The company does have more control over that than a true open source approach does. So with open core, sure, you can make changes, but at the end of the day, it's that company that owns that source code that's going to be calling the shots on it. And that may not be what you want, and your contributions may be ignored, or they just may not be put in at all, and so all your work goes for nothing.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not at all worried about Microsoft. Actually, it's actually good that Microsoft is in the fold, because it's better to have a friend
Yes.
Than a foe. And a lot of people don't actually understand how the industry is working to understand, why Microsoft is investing in all these technologies. So it's good.
Well, open source won. It's simple as that. It is the methodology to make software. The only major company that disagrees with that is Apple. And, more Apple.
Actually, Apple
does something. Yeah,
does a lot of open source. And actually, last year at KubeCon in Seattle, I saw an Apple booth for the first time.
Really?
At KubeCon, they are heavy users of Mesos. I was talking to
really, I did not know that.
Mesos founder Ben Hinman,
Yep.
And he said, Apple is, because Siri, it's all those, they run on, all these open source technologies.
That's true. That's true. Even Apple, even though what you have on your lap is the front is all proprietary. Underneath it, all the services though have to be open source because that's what everything runs on now.
And I was talking to FreeBSD Foundation's executive director.
Right.
PlayStation runs on FreeBSD. A lot of Nintendo Switch runs on BSD. And I was talking to Andrew Waffa from ARM.
Right.
So he suggested that you should look beyond Linux kernel because the way BSD committee works is totally different. There is no hierarchical Linux and Greg. It's flat.
Right.
Anybody can contribute.
Right.
And you're responsible for the code. The code will be merged and accepted. And the thing I was like, but who is contributing? He says everybody,
Right.
because the thing is if Sony is using the code in their PlayStation, they do know that they should go and put the changes to the upstream.
Right.
Otherwise, they will create a soft fork of BSD, which means they have to invest 10 developers just to maintain this code.
Right.
Then what is the point?
Right. You've made a semi-proprietary fork, and now you're wasting your developer money and time. When you could be putting it upstream, everyone wins, everyone gets better.
Right. So he was like, the only difference is that they don't talk about it publicly because it doesn't serve them any purpose.
Sure.
They cannot use it. By saying that, hey, we use open source, will not sell more PlayStations or will not sell more Nintendo Switches.
Yeah.
So it's the world that we live in. That's where open source is used as a marketing tool. So companies said, hey, we do open source, so come and use it. So, but he was like, everybody contributes.
Sure.
And when I talked to FreeBSD Foundation's executive director, she also said the same thing, whether it's Netflix or Apple or Sony, they all heavy contributors. That's where the contribution is coming from.
Sure.
So
it's for selfish purposes they share. It seems contradictory, but that actually is how open source works, and it's good to keep that in mind.
Yes. So I'm not at all worried. Let's talk about something contemporary very briefly about Richard Stallman.
Yes.
What do you, before I share my own thoughts, he has stayed with us.
Right.
I've known him since 2009. We met him in India. I spent 3 days with him. We are also like friends. I respect him. I admire him for 2 things. One is GNU GPL version 2.
Right.
And the second is the Free Software Foundation that he created, and which wrote a lot of software, open source. Free software. That is it.
Yes.
But beyond that, I found him to be becoming more and more irrelevant over time, because every time I talk to him, he's still stuck in a phase where his idea is like with Free Software Foundation. Or with GNU GPL, he solved a problem. Now he's not solving a problem. He's telling you not to use Internet of Things. He's telling you not to use cloud. He's telling you not to drink water. If it is coming from Bisleri. That is not solving a problem. What do you think about it?
I think Richard M. Stallman, RMS, made 2 fundamentally great contributions, and he deserves his MacArthur Genius Award for that. One was just GNU software itself, particularly the GNU C compilers. As a VI fan, to a lesser extent, Emacs, and the GPL, particularly version 2. But that was 25, 30 years ago. And since then, he really hasn't done anything. He's become more and more irrelevant. He is still a folk hero to a lot of people because he defiantly is always waving the free software flag. But he's become more irrelevant as time has gone on. Actually, that very split over open source and free software, because open source was basically saying explicitly that free software could be used to create business software. And he refused to go along with that, wanted to have nothing to do with it. It was a very much for him, free software is a philosophical thing. It's why he dislikes the cloud, why he dislikes the Internet of Things, though God knows there's lots of things to worry about the Internet of Things. But he's basically still stuck preaching about the same things he talked about, again, decades ago. Things have changed. His issues are no longer relevant to us today. Or rather, the fundamental issue that free software is important and open source is important, although he would never say open source is important, that is still true, but it's no longer something we need to argue about. As we were just saying earlier, Apple uses it, Microsoft uses it. We won, okay? We get it. You may not like exactly how it all turned out, we won, because you never know when you have a revolution how that evolution will look after it has matured and become the new reality. But, here we are, and he's still stuck in the past, and his actions and comments have done more to harm the cause of free software and open source than anything else. He has annoyed any number of developers who have stepped away from GNU and stepped away from the Free Software Foundation. And, again, he still appeals to his fan base. His fan base grows increasingly smaller, and they're less and less relevant to the larger software world. At the same time, he's always has had, let's call them personality problems, and those have seemed to have gotten accentuated over time. And also, again, because he's still stuck decades ago. For example, we're now in the age of Me Too, where people are no longer accepting of abuse to women. And he seems completely oblivious to that. And you can no longer defend a friend for being involved with a sexually abusive situation with an underage girl and expect people to just go, oh, that's just Stallman being Stallman. Because if you look over his writings, which are public, this has nothing to do with my opinion. You can look over his stuff on let's call it a blog. It's not really a blog. And you can see him defending pedophilia in theory. And that was never really all that acceptable. He was sort of doing it, though, in a small world to himself. But now he's saying it in a world where you can't get away with that sort of commentary. He said it in an MIT semi-public mailing list, and understandably, people looked at this and said, no, we can't do this anymore. But this is really, though, from people on the outside might think, oh, this is this sudden revelation. No, people have known this for years about him. This was much more the straw that broke the camel's back. I know people who are in the free software community, and for years now, many of them have wanted to put RMS out to pasture, and it would reluctantly, because again, a lot of them feel very much they have found his past positions very appealing. It's what got them into this world in the first place. But they've realized it's time for him to go. And, the day has finally come. And I think it's a good thing. Now the question is, can the Free Software Foundation reinvent itself into being a truly useful organization, both for free software supporters and for the larger free software open source world? I hope they can, because I'm afraid for the last few years, the Free Software Foundation has really been, from many people's point of view, simply a venue for RMS to get, just keep repeating his same speeches and, to keep a roof over his head. And that's, a foundation should be more than that. A foundation should be more than keeping its leader gainfully employed.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Like Free Software Foundation Europe, they totally, we have nothing to do. And actually, Richard and FS, they tried to goad them into accepting, and they said, no, we have nothing to do with SFS.
Right.
We are a Free Software Foundation. Europe is totally different.
Right.
And you actually, what you said about FSF today is totally true. I was actually about to ask the question. What is the relevance of SFS today?
Right.
No, OSI is there. I don't know what they're doing other than, they gave the whole, But so I think organizations like Linux Foundation actually playing much better role in actually solving problem, bringing together. But those kind of foundations, I don't really know what they're doing, because back in those days, setting up definition of, like, for example, what OSI should be doing is tackling this open core problem. They should be tackling with, there's a big issue going on between, companies struggling with cloud, but they are not. So I don't even know whether they have just become organizations to just fund their employees, or they're actually doing anything.
Well, I see, as far as just pure software freedom goes, I think much more useful work is being done by I'm going to blow the acronym, SFLC, who are defending the legal side of software freedom. I think those folks are doing really valuable work.
SFC is also doing good work.
Yep. And, they're small, but they're feisty, and they do important work. Open Source Initiative is now facing a challenge, I think, with the growth of Open Core. And for years, OSI, the Open Source Initiative, has been doing valuable work in helping to define what open source really is and what it is not from a licensing point of view, but it's a very narrow market. I sort of see them, it's very vital, but it's very small, and except for when these licensing war issues come up, it's really fairly invisible, and it's certainly invisible on the larger world of software. But one thing they could do, I don't know if they will or not, is address the issue of open core in a more productive, proactive way rather than the more reactive way they have been. But it's a new challenge for them, because for years now it's been all about just defending the definition and giving new licenses the blessing to keep going or not. They're very small and very and they're funded fine for what they were doing, for trying to do. I saw a suggestion earlier today on Twitter that perhaps the OSI should have their own conference defending what open source is or is not, and they could do that, but that's not in their wheelhouse. They don't have the resources, they don't have the money, the meeting expertise to do that yet. Maybe they could. We'll have to see how that works out. But for so SFLC, they have a role defending software freedom legality. OSI, they're defending open source licensing, vital small role. Free Software Foundation, what do they do?
Exactly.
And they need to do something, and or they'll just fade away entirely. And I have questions out to the Free Software Foundation now, and I've been talking to some other people, and we'll see what they have to say. Some others, like Red Hat, have some ideas about what the Free Software Foundation could do. Red Hat would like to just see them open up, being not just a white male group, and we'll see. I hope they're able to revise themselves, because the Linux Foundation, which is the 800-pound gorilla of open source organizations is very much, it's a corporate organization. It's for industry and company players, which is a very vital and useful thing. The Apache Foundation is great for people who are developing in the various Apache projects. But what I don't see is an organization for individual software users of free and open source software. I don't see anyone standing up for them. Think of it as one possible role for the Free Software Foundation might be as a consumer union for individual free software and open source users rather than corporate software users. I think that might be a valuable role for them. They just need to do something though, because again, their purpose for the last few years has really just been to provide a home for Stallman.
Right. I think we have touched upon a wide range of topics. Should we wrap it up now?
Sure.
Or you want to talk about something else? You want to talk about something else, or should we wrap it up?
Let's just go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah.
I think we've been at this for about an hour.
Yeah. It's almost 1 hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think these organizations should just they should come to the modern world as well.
Right.
They are in their comfort zone. They should get out. OIN is actually doing much more work. Microsoft donated their patents there, so they are doing much more critical and important work than so these organizations should, as you suggested, FSF, they should try to identify some issues and try to solve them instead of just staying in their comfort zone.
They are I'm blanking on the acronym of the Open Source Patent Defense League, but
Open Invention Network or Open OIN.
Open Invention Network, OIN. They're doing really valuable work on the patent side. It's, again, one of those issues that most people don't think about, but patents are absolutely vital to the software universe and keeping open source software truly open. And they've done great work with Microsoft. They're doing great work with the Chinese companies who own an enormous amount of intellectual property and are getting a lot more. Which, by the way, it may sound esoteric, but it's not. We're going to see all kinds of problems developing with 5G technology because Huawei owns a lot of the 5G intellectual property and have it patented, and we now have this entire trade war going on. So that will significantly slow down 5G adoption. Sorry, all you who've been reading about all these 5G stories and think that it's right around the corner. Actually, intellectual property issues are going to put a real damper on getting that out as fast as you might like. But that's entirely a side issue.
So thanks, SJVN, for geeking out today. I think it's recorded for 1 hour or so like that.
Okay.
But this was the first time we sat down, and I think every time we meet, we should set some time aside and just because you have a big fan following. I mean, mine is a tiny one, so they would love to, just...
Okay, well, I'm always happy to chat with you because it's always a pleasure. You know your stuff. Occasionally, I know my stuff.
No, I was about to say that, compared to you, I know only this much, so it's really,
This was not one of my better days, but oh well.
So once again, thank you.
My pleasure. I look forward to doing it again.
Yeah.